Our reading for this evening is probably one of, if not the most well-known of Jesus' parables, the parable of the prodigal son, which we find in Luke chapter 15, from verses 11 to 24. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. And not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? Here I am, starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate." I wish you were dead. That's the striking way in which Jesus begins this very familiar parable, because that's how his hearers would have heard this request made by the younger son. The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And the audience would have been immediately hooked, because such a request is totally unthinkable. A child can't inherit until the parent dies. So the son really was saying, "I wish you were dead. Your money means more to me than your life does. Drop dead." That's what the son was saying. What would the father do? Surely he would beat his son or cast him out completely. Those are the questions which Jesus' hearers would have been asking. What's going to happen next? We're very familiar with the parable of the prodigal son. Do we even know what the word prodigal means? But this evening I want to try and tell it in a way that Jesus' first hearers would have received it. I want to view the parable of the prodigal son through the eyes of the peasant farmers listening to Jesus the poet. In it we learn a lot about God, represented in the story by the loving father, and about ourselves, portrayed by the son, who's hopelessly lost, but then comes back home again. The story starts with a son who is lost. And of course, he was long lost before he made that ridiculous request, even before he wanted to leave home. Something must have been very wrong with his relationship, with his home, with his family, with his father, already for him to make such an outrageous request. "Give me my share of the estate." Dividing the property would only finalize the split, which must already have existed between father and son. But the father shows amazing patience, generosity, doing what the son requests. He divided his property between them. But then the son goes further, and not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. We've got to see just how scandalous what that son did next would be to those people. He ignored his obligation, even if he'd come into possession of the family estate, his share of it. His obligation was to stay with the family and continue to work that land, but instead he sells the land off to others, to strangers, to go traveling. That was so much against the convention. It was an insult to his brother as well as to his father. Indeed, it was an insult to the whole village. So no wonder he ran away to a far country, somewhere where nobody knew him, because as he'd gone from buyer to buyer, each would have been shocked and appalled, horrified, disgusted at what he was doing, selling off the family estate. The whole community would have turned against him. So he ran away not long after that, even though property sales in the Middle East take even longer than they do here, and would have lasted months and months. So this second son was lost. He was already lost, but things only got worse. Cut off from his family and friends. He was a stranger in a foreign land. He'd thrown away everything which makes life worth living. And for a while he had his money, but then he squandered his wealth in wild living. After a few months of wine, women, and song, the younger son was left with absolutely nothing. How low can you get? The parable gives us a vivid picture of what life is like for so many people in the world, trying to find happiness in money, in possessions, in entertainment, but all the time in a far country, alienated from the God who made them and created them for a relationship with him. People who said to God, "I wish you were dead." People with the same self-centered attitude as the son, gimme, 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 demanding his inheritance before the father died. But he has to sink lower into the depths before he'd be ready to return home. And we chart his decline. He squandered his wealth in wild living, throwing everything away in extravagant, wasteful lifestyle. That's, by the way, that's what a prodigal is. A prodigal is not a returning son or a repentant son, as some people misunderstand the parable. The word prodigal means a wasteful, reckless, profligate, squandering son. He was lost long before he was wasteful. In some ways, his extravagance was the least of his sins and not the greatest. But things went from bad to worse, and after he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him into his field to feed pigs. He began to be in need. There's an understatement. He was so desperate, he ended up working for a citizen of that country, by definition a Gentile, not a Jew. And doing that would be as shameful, as disgraceful as that of the Jewish traitors who became tax collectors working for the Romans. And the only work available was feeding the pigs. As we know in Judaism, pigs are ritually unclean animals, they're not kosher. So working with them would make it impossible for the younger son to practice his religion. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't even keep the Sabbath. He certainly couldn't go to synagogue. Could things get any worse? Well, they did. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods the pigs were eating. No one gave him anything. He was absolutely starving. Whatever challenges people may face in life, the problems that foolish young man was experiencing were worse. No one could be farther away from God than that young son was from the father he'd wished was dead. But there's still hope. He came to his senses. Literally, it says he came to himself. The son realized how foolish he'd been. Doesn't say at this stage that he was sorry for what he'd done, how he'd insulted his father, thrown away all his resources, but at least he realized his life was in a mess and that he had to do something about it. He came to himself. And for all the prodigals in the world, that's the starting point. Coming to our senses. Coming to ourselves. So the son comes up with this cunning plan. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father." He realized the only thing he could do was go back home. That's the next step for all prodigals when they come to their senses. It is to come back to God. But his plan was brilliant. I will set out, I'll go back to my father, I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. Because if he became a hired servant, he'd keep his self-respect. He'd retain his independent position in the town. He wouldn't need to become a slave to pay off his debts. He'd work hard to earn money to pay his father back. At that point, the prodigal son wasn't looking for forgiveness. He wasn't looking to be reconciled to his father. He just wanted a second chance and a way out of the mess that he was in. So he got up and went to his father. And that's the first sensible thing the boy has done in the whole story so far. He hadn't just recognized all that he'd lost. He'd actually done something about it. He could have stayed, just wallowed in self-pity in the pigsty, making the best of the very worst. But then he would never have discovered the incredible love his father had for him. The young son didn't stay lost. He got up. He went back to his father. And it's a wonderful thing when a person comes to their senses, realizes they're lost in a far country away from God. But then there are too many people who try and work out how can they get back into God's good books? How can they earn God's forgiveness? Like the son's master plan of becoming a hired servant. Many people think what they have to do is to become a hired servant for God, love their neighbors, give to the poor. But God's not looking for that. God doesn't need our master plans of how to get back to him. God has a much more loving, wonderful plan. All we need to do is to follow the example of the prodigal son and get up and head back to the Father. And that's when the miracle happens. The lost son is found. Jesus' parable gives us a wonderful picture of the amazing love of God. Because God doesn't save us from ourselves so that we can become his hired servants. He welcomes us as sons and daughters in his family. He got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. The son said to his father, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to become your son. And that was true. He was no longer worthy, but the loving father had been watching out, waiting, longing for his son to come home, just as God is always looking out, filled with compassion, filled with love for us all, waiting for us to come back to him. And then what happens is a big surprise. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. He ran to his son. Wait a minute. In the Middle East, there are very good reasons why fathers of a certain age don't run. First of all, it's much too hot for folk of a certain age to run anywhere, but also it would be so undignified. The father was an important man. If there's any running to be done, he would send a slave to go and do the running. But in Jesus' parable, the father himself runs to his son. And that wasn't just because he was pleased to see him. Because remember, the villagers would have been so angry with the son selling off part of the family estate. The villagers would be ready to greet him with clenched fists or worse. So the father needed to get to the son before the rest of the village did, before they beat him up or before they even killed him. So the father needed to demonstrate to the whole community that he was welcoming his son back, and so they should do as well. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son had his speech already. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. All these things are true. And the father didn't care about that. The father wasn't waiting for the son to confess, to repent. All that mattered was that his son had come home. And he was welcomed. The father said to the servants, quick, Bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. The best robe in the house, of course, was the father's own robe. It was reserved for special occasions. The ring would be a signet ring, demonstrating that the son had been restored to a position of trust in the family estate as a son, not as a servant. Sandals were for free men, not for servants. And the servant dressed him. He didn't dress himself because he was a son in the family. The servants dressed him. And the fattened calf is killed. That would have been prepared for special occasions when the whole community would be invited and they would have a feast. And the son would be the guest of honor because the father wanted the whole town to know that his son had come home and been restored to his former position in the family. Let's have a feast and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. The son was dead, he was now alive. He'd been lost, now he'd been found. And there isn't time for us to go through in too much detail the beautiful poetry which Jesus has here, called palistrophe. A form of poetry in which there is a symbolism where the events at the beginning of the story are mirrored by events at the end. And what happens first, then something similar happens at the end. What happens second, just before the end. What happens third, before that, and so on, with a turning point in the middle. In the symmetry, beforehand, the goods were wasted in extravagant living, and in the end, they're used in joyful celebration. The lost son went away from the father, but then he returned to the father. Everything was lost, and the son found himself in need. Afterwards, everything was restored again. The son fell into great sin, even feeding pigs, but this led to a sincere repentance. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And from a place of total rejection where nobody gave him anything, the son came home to a place where everything was given to him. In this symmetrical structure, beginning end, of such a poem, the most important line is the middle line in the middle of the story. It's the emphasized line, and it's verse 17 in this story. He came to his senses. That's the turning point of this, the chiasmus of this poem. That realization of need was the turning point, not just in the poem, but in the boy's life. And it is for every prodigal. That's the most important point. When they come to themselves and realize they're lost, and they set out to return to God. And of course, we talk of it as the parable of the prodigal son, but it's not really about the wasteful son. This is a parable of the love of God, the Father representing here the God who is looking out for his lost children to return, the father who saw the son when he was a long way off. We only need to take a single step back towards God. He's already running towards us. God's watching, waiting, longing for each and every person to return to him. The Father filled with compassion for the Son, as God is for each of us. Not anger, but overflowing love and mercy. The Father threw his arms around his Son and kissed him, demonstrating acceptance and forgiveness. And this is how God longs to welcome all the wasteful prodigals. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. A particular word this evening for those, if you're watching on Facebook, watching the recording on YouTube, and you're in that position of the lost son in the far country, in desperate need, wanting to come back to God. If we, the church, can help you in any way, find your way back to the God who is looking out for you, waiting for you to turn back to him, please do drop us an email, drop us a Facebook message, get in touch. We'd love to help you if you are a prodigal still lost. Come back to the God who loves you so